Hi, this is Bob from INSYDIUM, and this is the final part of our snow peel tutorial. So we'll take our lollipop sim, which is now cached, and we're going to finalize those render settings. We'll adjust the lighting, we'll make some tweaks to our materials, and we'll set up those final settings for render. So here we are in our lollipop scene, and now we're going to make our final adjustments to get this ready for render time. Alright, so let's get that sorted, and what we're going to do is make some adjustments to our scene lights, obviously. And if we just come out of this camera, just to remind you, we have these two big soft boxes lighting our scene, this orange one and this blue one. And if we go back to our real-time preview, you'll see that in our draft render at the moment, it's going to be looking a little bit flat, those colours. Let's go to frame 80. Let's load this in with all of those particles, and you're going to see that both the red in the lollipop is going to be looking a bit washed out, and we just don't have as much kind of colour vibrancy as we had. If we bring in our beauty render, you can see we've got this really rich red. We can see the reflection, look, of the specular of our orange light is quite a saturated orange. And then if you look in our snow itself, we've got this really bright blue, but we've got this diffuse orange colour colouring that snow as well. And then if we move back to our render, look, it's all very white and very washed out, isn't it? And that's because our lighting isn't quite right. So first of all, before we do anything, before we move lights or anything, we can just change the saturation of them. So let's go to our first softbox, and let's just give this way more blue. So we'll make the blue more saturated, and we'll just move it along the hue there so it's a little bit more of a blue colour. Something like that is looking good. And already just by doing that, look how good these orange lights look. So that's that. Now let's go to our orange light, and again we want to increase the saturation of this orange light. Make it more orange. Okay, so we have our light set. The orange light is set to a strength of 15 here, and our blue light is also set to a strength of 15. If we make this light bigger, like physically bigger, it's going to be emitting more light. So that's what we're going to do. So I think it'd be a good idea here. Look, if we go and highlight our camera that we're looking through at the moment, and then in our real-time preview, click this lock camera button. Click on that. So now if I come out of this camera in the scene, it's still going to render our camera view. So we can reposition this and have a look at these lights, and it's going to render this camera view, which is really cool. So with our, let's just turn this around something like this. Let's take our blue light. Do you know what? Before we do, let's just take out some of these particles so we're not having to render all of these hundreds of thousands of particles. So we can take away the surface ones, which are the most. There's 500,000 in there. And let's, no, we'll leave that. We'll leave those. So we'll just take out some of those. So with this blue light, if we make this blue light bigger light, it's going to be much more dominant and offer more illumination. Look how much more illumination that is offering. And what we'll do with that is I'm just going to move it back in our scene a bit, and I'm going to hit R for the rotate tool and kind of angle it down and towards our lollipop. So something a little bit like that. Okay. And then with our orange light, let's make this bigger as well. We want it to be more powerful in our scene. And now you can see, look at the difference that has made by angling that orange light. Now, arguably, we have gone a little bit too far there. It's been a bit powerful, but let's just keep it this strength, but we'll just angle it up a little bit so it's not quite as direct. And you will see that this will make changes to the specular in our lollipop. Look, if we angle it way up like this, it's now not having as much of an impact. If we angle it down, obviously it's going to start having more. So that's looking pretty good. Okay, so we're going to make some more adjustments to that lighting, but let's just leave it as is for now. Let's address our material in our lollipop. So I'll just move our real-time preview to this side here. We'll go to our material manager. Let's open up our red candy. Now this material, let's just remind ourselves what we have. Now at first you think, oh my goodness, this looks really complicated, but actually there's not a huge amount going on. What we have, we're taking a noise texture. Let's just press the color output. So this noise texture has been mapped to our red material. We're using the factor of that, which is values between 0 and 1. We can display that as a black and white map. Look, you can see this black and white map on the red. And what we're doing is we're clamping that with this color ramp to this. So we're getting these black and white values. And then we're using those black and white values in a height map of our bump, which is giving us, if we just take that off, it's giving us this nice bumpy texture. And that's going in, that bump creates a normal map, which goes into the normals of our shader. And this is doing all of the hard work with the coloring. So this is where we can control. Look, if we turn the specular off on our shader, you'll notice that that specular highlight disappears. Now, obviously, we want a specular highlight. That's really important. We could maybe reduce the roughness slightly. And the color that we're getting, this red color, is we're using this same noise texture. We're feeding it into a color ramp to remap that these kind of colors of red. So let's have a look at that. And it's just a very subtle color variation. This may look just perfectly one color, but this is actually a mottled red color based on that noise. But this is not a rich red that we need. It's too kind of orangey and washed out. So let's just get our attributes here and we can change this. So we'll get this knot. And let's just reduce the value, just the saturation slightly, and make that really much darker and richer. We'll take this knot, and again, we'll do the same. We'll make it dark and really rich. And then this knot, we still want it to be red. We can take some of that saturation and some of the lightness out of it. So now if we come out of this color, now we've got a much richer red. Now look, we've obviously gone too far, haven't we? So let's go to this knot and bring a bit more lightness back into it. And we're bringing some of that red back in, you see. Let's put that value up, the saturation up. All right, so that's looking much more rich. Let's come back here. I think now that we have done that, we can really see our specular coming through, can't we? But I think we have made it too. If we take the roughness off completely, you can see that that specular becomes really obvious, but we want to kind of make it a little bit more diffuse, and to do that, we do it with the roughness. So let's pull this roughness back up a little bit more. And then what we can do is we can add a clear coat on top of this. So imagine we've got a smooth surface over the bumpy surface, and here is our clear coat. So if we put this on full, now we have got a consistent clear coat on top of that bumpy red surface. Okay, so that's looking good for our red one. Let's switch that down and let's do our white candy. And what we'll do with this is we'll just add that clear coat like we did with our red, and I think we can just leave the rest as is. All right, so that's looking much better. We're getting a much nicer look in that scene. Now if let's move forward a frame to say frame 120, where we've got more of it revealed, and look how much richer that is, that red. That's starting to look really, really quite nice now. Pleased with that. Okay, so another thing to consider now that we have got that sorted is if we have a look at our beauty, we're getting closer to this look, but you need to remember that Cycles 4D is a path tracing render engine. It mimics how light works in the real world, and it bounces all of these light rays around our scene, and those light rays kind of reflect and they illuminate the scene. And you can see here that, look, we can see the effects of our really strong blue light on the floor here. But look, the blue light is behind this tree. If we have a look at this blurred out tree here, we can see the orange light hitting it, and the blue light is hitting it from behind. So in effect, this tree is obscuring the blue light from our lollipop a little bit, and it's only the when the particles move past it through kind of the gaps in those branches that the blue is then really illuminating it. The blue light is also bouncing off the floor. There is a floor covered in highly reflective snow here, so that is affecting how this overall lighting is working in our scene. So what we need to do is we need really to mimic some of those things in our setup. So let's switch down our real-time preview. Let's turn off this. So what we should really do, even if we're not going to render it, is bring in a floor object and bring in something that we're acting a bit like these trees, which are blocking some of the light. So what we could do is this. Look, let's bring in a... What could we bring in? Let's bring in a plane first, and we'll just move it down, and let's make this plane really big. So this plane's going to be our floor object. Let's call that floor. All right. And then we also want to bring in something that's going to act a bit like a tree. So what we could do is, look, let's bring in a cylinder. This is going to be our tree, and we need to have it kind of blocking this light. Let's do something like this. All right. Make it a bit fatter. Okay, so those two things are going to make a huge difference to our render. Let's go to our INSYDIUM Cycles 4D real-time preview. Let's go to our camera. So now that we have these things in our scene, obviously we don't want to see them in our render. So we can do that by, if we select both of them, the cylinder and the floor, we don't want to see them in our scene here. We just want the effects of them. So if we go to tags, let's go to extensions, INSYDIUM, Cycles 4D tags, we can put an object tag on there. And this is going to work like a compositing tag. We can say, don't be seen by the camera. Be seen by all these different rays, but don't be seen by the camera. Let's do that. So now they are switched off in our scene, but they are contributing to the way in which the light is working in our scene. So there we have the what the scene looks like with those objects switched on. Let's switch them off. Look at the difference. So it's really important to have these objects in our scene to kind of match those settings. And now that we have got this, and we're blocking quite a lot, what we could do is, I think we could afford to switch up, turn up the power of our blue. So let's go to our blue light, and let's put this up to, well, try really high. Let's try 25. Yeah, so we're getting some really nice, strong illumination now, but because it's being blocked by our tree somewhat, it's not affecting our lollipop too much. Okay, so that's looking really good. So an interesting thing to bear in mind, that when you're using a renderer like Cycles, scene objects play a part in the way in which that light is bouncing around your scene. So obviously the scene objects have an effect on how your render is going to look. Okay, so what have we got? Let's just recap. We've got all of our particles sorted. We have got our lighting and our materials looking pretty good. And now we have got our emitter lights sorted out. So now all we need to do really is start thinking about animating the camera, and then we can try and spit out a test render. So let's have a look at our camera, and what we want to do is we want this camera to animate. Well, let's just have a look at our beauty and we can remind ourselves how it was done. So you can see that the camera is moving down slightly throughout that, and always having a little bit of camera movement is so important to sell this shot, because what we're going to get is we're going to get a little bit of parallaxing because of the background, and we're also going to get parallax between the particles, especially when we add the depth of field effects. It just brings everything, and you can see it's a really subtle camera movement, but it's just moving down our lollipop. So let's get that set up. What would be useful would be to get our end camera position. So around frame 150 is where we stop really animating here. So we can have our end position at frame 150. So let's go and get our preview up so we're able to have a look at what this looks like at this point, and then we can have a look at where we want this camera to end. All right, so is this a good end point? Let's just take our protection tag off our camera once more so I can move it around should we wish. I think we're looking pretty good there, to be honest. Let's just say, yeah, let's say I'm pretty happy with that. I think that is going to work for us. So we needlessly took that protection tag off. Let's just put it back on. Rigging tag protection. All right. So instead of animating the actual camera, what we're going to do is stick it in a null object and animate that null object. I always find it easier doing that. So we'll click here for a new null, and let's rename this cam control. And we'll put our camera as a child of that. And now with this cam control, if we go to the coordinates, we can now animate this on the Y. Look. Excellent. So what we want to do is we want to move the camera down. So let's, on frame 150, let's zero that out. We want to put a keyframe. And then let's move back to frame, well, we only really need to look at when we're going to be rendering from. We're not going to be rendering the whole scene. We're going to be starting from, at a guess, around maybe frame 70. Yeah, I mean, we can start, I think we'll be actually starting it from later than this, but we can start it on frame 70 for us. So for frame 70, we want to be lifting the camera up a bit. Not much, we don't want much movement here. Maybe just, let's try 6 centimeters there and hit a keyframe. Now with these keyframes, we want this just to be a linear animation. I don't want this to ease in and ease out. So we need to go to our timeline to sort that out. So one quick way of doing that, look, we can right click here on the Y where we've put the keyframe. We can go to animation and we can go show F curve, which brings up our manager here. Let's just switch down our real-time preview. So here's our Y position. We can hit H to frame the keyframes. Here are our keyframes. If we hit Control A, it'll select all of the keyframes, and you can see, look, they have handles. This is actually a curve, and we want them to be linear, so we can push this button to make these linear. Right, let's close down our timeline. So now we've got that. Let's switch our particles off so we can just see that animating. So there's going to be a static camera, but then at frame 70, when we're going to start our rendering, the camera is going to move. And there we go, and we can see it moving up. And it's subtle, but we only want a subtle move. We don't want it to be moving much. All right, so that's looking pretty cool. So then let's go into maybe frame 100. Let's activate all of our particles. Let's go to our real-time preview. And let's have a look at where we are here. Cool. Now, one thing we haven't done yet, let's just increase the size of this just a little bit. And I'm going to increase this from 50% up to 70%. So we can see it a bit more clearly. Now, we haven't done any depth of field effects on this just yet, so we'll come in closer. So what we want to do is we want to focus, and you'll see that as soon as we put some depth of field effects in this, the look is just going to transform. And we want to kind of be focused around the center of our lollipop. And so what we need to do is go to our camera. We can go to the Object tab and come down, and we're looking for the focus distance. Here it is. So let's pick right at the center of our lollipop, which has changed that focus distance. And now if we go to our Cycles 4D camera tag, we can go to the depth of field. Let's give it 6 blades, the aperture, and we're going to make, we don't need much. At this scale, we're only going to need a small radius. Let's try maybe 0.03. And there, look, straight away we have put some of those out of focus, and it's starting to look very, very cool indeed. Arguably, we could maybe have even less. Let's try 0.02. Yeah. Well, we can leave that for now. That'll do for our test. So that's looking very cool indeed. Now, one more thing that we need to do, which we haven't done just yet, is address our bool object, which we haven't actually textured yet. This is just kind of rendering the default grey. If we switch off all of our particles, we can see here is our bool object, and if we go down to our scene geometry, the bool has no material. So let's just start that rendering again so we can see that. There it is. And what we want to do is give this a material. Now, there's a couple of things to point out here. Now, this is going to be masked and hidden by all of the particles, so it doesn't really matter. But you can see here, look, we can see the individual triangle polygons that have been created by our bool object here. And if we wanted to smoothen this out somewhat, we can actually do that and subdivide it at render time. So look, if we go to our bool, and we go to tags, extensions, INSYDIUM cycles, and bring in an object tag. The object tag, I can go to displacement. Now, we don't actually have any displacement settings in our scene, but I can subdivide the mesh with a smoothing algorithm with Catmull-Clark. We do that, and you'll see, look, it's smoothed out those polys. So that's pretty cool. And all we're going to do with this is we're going to put a bog standard white diffuse material on, because this isn't actually, it has to be 100% realistic, because it's kind of simulating snow stroke icing sugar. So if we just put a diffuse, it's going to work. So let's go Cycles 4D in our new materials here. Cycles 4D, surface, diffuse. We'll put this diffuse object on our bool, and we'll go into the diffuse, and let's just make the color just white. There we go. And that is our diffuse material on our lollipop. Excellent. Now we can reintroduce all of those particles. They'll be loaded into our scene, and there we go. Excellent. So now we're in a position, let's just close this down. Now, just interestingly, before we do, we're going to do a draft render now with the render settings. Now, you can see that we've been working on the premise that our real-time preview never gets beyond 10 samples, which is the quality of the render. And on 10 samples, even just 10, this is looking pretty good. We've got noise here, because we don't have enough samples for this scene, but it's not too bad. So as a draft, 10 samples is probably still too much, because all we want to do is see this animating in real time. If we put this down to a really low amount, look, let's put it on 4 samples. It'll render really quickly. It'll render really quickly on 4 samples, but it's not going to be good enough quality. So there, look, I mean, it's almost indistinguishable how long it takes to render, but we've got more noise But this is definitely on 4 samples, good enough quality to judge whether our animation and camera position and everything is looking good enough. So let's bear in mind that number, 4 samples. So what we're going to do is this. Let's go to our render menu and we're going to go to our edit render settings. Here are our render settings. Let's just make a bit more room. The renderer we want to pick, we don't want standard, we want to pick Cycles 4D. Then we're not going to actually save this. Let's unclick save. In our Cycles 4D settings, I'm going to pick the device that you want to pick. Well, if you have an optics graphics card, definitely pick optics because it is really, really fast. So I'm going to pick optics. And we're going to leave everything else default. You can see, look, by default, it only has 4 samples selected. So we'll leave it on that. It's going to be a really fast render. Everything else we can leave in the default settings. Okay, let's go to our output tab and we can, maybe don't even need to output it this big. Look, let's lock the ratio. I'm going to put the height down to 500. It's just a draft render. So the smaller you make it, the quicker it'll render. Something like that. And then the frame, we're going to do it from, well, where were those? Let's have a look. Where were those keyframes? If we highlight our cam control that we've keyframed, look, it's at frame. There's the first keyframe, 70 to 150. So let's do that. Frame 70 to frame 150. There we go. Excellent. So I'll close that down and then we can just go render to picture viewer. Yes, want to continue without saving. Here's our picture viewer. And let's just make that full screen. There we go. So let's just have a look at how long this is taking per frame. 6 seconds, so about 6 seconds. So what we'll do is I'll leave this chugging away. We'll pause it here. Once it's finished rendering, we'll come back and have a look. Okay, so that render is finished. It took 8 minutes and 38 seconds. And if we have a play through, we can see that we're getting a really nice effect. Now, let's have a look and talk about what's wrong and what needs fixing. So the first thing that I would suggest is wrong is, I'm not sure if you remember, but we actually reduced the size of our small particles down in the instance tag a little bit to thin them out. And I think arguably we've thinned them out too much. We could risk making those a little bit bigger. And then the other problem in my mind is that we have got in this out of focus part of the scene, we've got quite a few particles still coming across at this part of the animation. There's a big chunk here, look, and some other wispy bits going across. Now a little bit of that is nice for kind of like the parallax, but it's kind of obscuring our area that is in focus, the kind of the hero area of the lollipop. So there's a couple of things there that we can rectify. So let's just come out of that picture viewer. Let's just close down our material manager and we'll just come out of our camera and let's have a look at where that problem area is. So it's around kind of this part. You can see it here. We've still got particles from this edge animating. Look at these black particles here, animating themselves away, and they're kind of obscuring the camera too much. So that isn't going to work for us, and we need to get rid of those. So we can sort that out. Now we could sort that out with our particle painting trick and just delete them out, or we could resim. In my mind, I want to get these simmed correctly, and I think the easiest and most controlled way of making sure that we solve this problem is just to make this part of the lollipop a kind of a killed zone where we can't have any particles. So the way in which we are going to do that is we're going to go to our modifiers, we're going to add a modifier, and we're going to add a control modifier and a kill, an XP kill. And what we're going to do is, if we just come out, you can see that this big green cube has appeared in our scene. And this is saying this will kill any particle at the moment outside of the cube. Now we don't want that. We want to change it to inside, and we want to change the shape from a box to a sphere. And then what we're going to do is make this sphere a lot smaller. And we're just going to position this, size and position it, so that it doesn't allow particles to be made in that little zone that we've identified, that we want to be a kind of a particle-free zone. So it's kind of just down here. Now we don't want to get rid of many. It's a really subtle effect, this. We just want to maybe prevent particles from being created there. And again, look, we may have gone a little bit too far here. Let's bring it back so it's kind of central. We don't want to go overboard and kill too many. So something like that. So just on that very edge. And it's just going to clean up those ones and mean that we're not going to have those encroaching on our scene. So maybe something like that. All right. So now that we have set up that kill, now what we need to do is re-simulate and re-cache those emitter particles, and this time these will be absent. So what we can do, so this again, remember, so this cache goes a bit more quickly. We can switch off the bool, but we need to have all of the spheres and everything active underneath it because they're being used in our particle question. So now that we've done that, good, let's go to our cache, and then we can just overwrite this. So let's build cache, overwrite. That'll chug through. It takes about 2.5 minutes just over to simulate, and then we'll be ready to spit out another render. So I'll pause this now. I'll come back to you when it's finished. Okay, so that cache is done. It took just over 2.5 minutes to cache. Let's just switch our bool object back on. And now you can see, look, yes, look, we've got rid of those particles that were obscuring our, look, we're on the same frame, and we've got rid of those particles that were obscuring our view. So that has worked. We just want to hope we haven't got rid of too many, but look, yeah, I mean, look, there's still plenty of particles here. We've just got rid of these ones. So if we now go back into our camera and hit play, yeah, so now we should be able to see the kind of the hero peel of our lollipop without it being obscured by those particles that were really kind of blocking the view by the time we got to this point. So I'm pleased with that. So what I would urge you to do at this point would be to do another test render to make sure you're happy with those changes that you made. But for this tutorial, so we can move on and get onto the final render, we'll skip that stage and we'll set up those settings. So let's open our real-time preview, and we'll just have that going round. Let's go to a frame where we knew we had some of those kind of problem particles. So we'll skip forward to frame 108, let's say. So there we go. Yeah, so we've got rid of those problem particles now. So we need to do a couple of things. Remember, we said that we were going to make our snow particles a little bit bigger because they didn't seem quite big enough to fill out this area in our test render. So let's go to our small surface and small volume instance tags, and we'll increase that back up to, let's try 3.5, which will make those bigger. And what we could also do, yeah, look, see, that's filled that out already. Now, we're not really seeing enough quality here. We put our samples way down to 4. Let's put them closer to something that's going to be our final settings. Let's try 20 samples. And you can see, look, it's having to do loads more. And this is going to clean up and clean up. And we could also make this a bit bigger in our screen. Look, we've got our size down at 70% at the minute. Let's put it on 100% size, which is going to render a bigger area. So here we go, updating everything. So there we go. Yeah, that's looking like it's filled out. Loads more. We could even try making them slightly bigger. Let's go up to, I think we had this at 4 originally. Let's put it on 4. So again, it's got to rebuild the scene because it's got the best part of 1 million particles now that it's having to create. But look, that's pretty quick. Yes, so this is looking better with our depth of field. This size is looking fine, and this is looking, I'm really pleased with it. It's this is starting to look fantastic. Okay, so one thing that we could now do is start looking at our render quality. Now we've got through all of those 20 samples and this is looking pretty clean. In the blurred out parts there's still a little bit of noise. We can see a little bit of noise down here as well. So let's put this up to say 30 samples and this is going to give us a good idea. Now a little bit of noise, I always find a little bit of noise in the blurred out parts is actually fine, and if you look at real film effects you're going to see noise. So this is looking like 30 frames is going to work really well for us. 30 samples. Perhaps we don't even need it to be this detailed, because remember, the more samples you have, the longer this is going to take to render. All right, but that's done. So I'm saying that we could get away with having that slightly lower. So let's just shut down our real-time preview now. We're going to go to our render, edit render settings. In our cycles 4D, we're going to come to our settings where we set the samples. Now instead of just putting 30 in here, what we're going to do is switch this to something called adaptive sampling. Now this is really smart, because at the moment without adaptive sampling selected, it just uses the amount of samples in every pixel that you stipulate here, and sometimes it doesn't need it. So for example, our very dark black background areas don't need 20, 28, 30 samples. So we can do adaptive. So look, we will put the max amount of samples here. Let's put 30, but we'll click adaptive sampling. We're going to say the minimum amount of samples is going to be something like 12. And then we use this noise threshold, and this is what it uses to work out at what point it's going to use the higher or the lower number in our samples. So we'll just start this on something like 0.05. So if you've got larger amounts in here, it's more likely to use fewer samples. If you've got a small number in here, it's more likely to use the greater amount of samples. So because we put a small number in, it's more likely to be using the higher end, but it can use the lower end where it thinks, where it sees fit. So that's okay. Let's go to our output. And let's output this in, I'm just going to do ours in 720p, but obviously you can output whatever resolution you require. And obviously if you were doing this for production, you would go to your Save tab and you'd set up a file path for the format of, in which you were going to save it and all of that. But for us, we're just going to do this to the picture viewer. So that is all we need to do for now. Let's close it down. So we'll go to our render. We'll render to picture viewer. Yes, we'll save without a file name saved. Let's just bring our picture viewer in. We'll make this full screen. There we go. So that's looking really nice. And you can see we've got a little bit of noise in this illuminated bit, but we're going to get away with that. So at this point, obviously we'll pause it and I'll come back to you when this has been done. But you may have noticed that we haven't actually put any motion blur on our particles. And that is because in this scene, we're going to apply the motion blur in post. It means that our render from 3D is going to be much quicker than it would be if we were rendering this many particles with motion blur, but it also gives us the control in post of having a little bit more flexibility. So we'll leave this whirring away, and when it's finished we'll get back to you and we'll have a look at the final result. So here we are at the end of that render time, and that took 19 minutes and 19 seconds to render all of those frames. And if we have a look, you can see that we've got our looking pretty good. Now there's a couple of things I always like to point out what is wrong with an animation, and this is what you'll be doing at your draft stage to try and fix those issues. And a couple of things I can see here is that although this is looking really nice, we do have quite a bit of noise. If you look at this area of our render and I cycle through that, you can see that noise kind of fuzzing around the place. So arguably we could have done with a few more samples, but obviously that's something that we can that we can address in post-production as well. The only other thing I notice is right at the beginning we have just a little bit of regular stepping with our particles here, and that's just because we've got so many emitting very close to each other. And what we could do to alleviate this problem is to add just a little bit more variation in that wind and that turbulence strength in our mapping, just to kind of eradicate some of this stepping. But for the most part, this is looking really nice. Our materials are looking good. The lights are really working. Our lollipop is really kind of popping. We've got these all-important residual particles which have been left behind. This is looking great. Now finally, let's just jump into After Effects just to have a look at this scene with some post-production motion blur working. So here we are in After Effects, and here is our animation of our snow, which we can scrub through. So let's just add some post motion blur, and this is not a paid for plugin, this ships with After Effects. So we can go to Effect, we can go to Time, and under Time we have Pixel Motion Blur. So in particle scenes like this, where we have particles that aren't moving particularly quickly, and we haven't got kind of really fast changes of direction, then this pixel motion blur will work really well for us. So what we need to do is adjust the shutter angle. It's going to give us more or less motion blur. So let's put this up at say 400. And now you can see that motion blur has been added, and we can see there's a bit of stepping here. You can see there's stepping in our motion blur, so we need to add shutter samples. The faster your particles are moving, the more shutter samples you're going to need. Let's put this up at say 15. So the disadvantage of having more shutter samples is that it takes longer to calculate. But there we have that. So let's play that through now. And there we go. So we've got some motion blur added. And obviously if you wanted to go way overboard, we could put this up to say 700. And then there's going to be loads of motion blur in that. And you'll see that although this is a post effect, because our particles, as I said, aren't changing direction really rapidly, this motion blur is working really well for us. And so we've added lots of motion blur. Now I perhaps wouldn't have had it set so high, but that's fine. So there we have our simulation playing in real time, and that's looking great. Really pleased with that.